The adoption of the declaration was a significant moment, but it is the content of the declaration that I think is critically important. And we're going to be talking about it. I'm joined on this panel by Tshepo Mongoai, who is on our economics desk, Ronesh, who runs our research desk, and Sophie Mokoena is a specialist correspondent with us. And we're going to be combing through some of the details in that declaration that came out. What stood out for me, and this is where I want to start the conversation tonight, it is on the partnership with Africa, the forming of a compact, the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Act, industrialization, and the talk around the launch of the Africa Engagement Framework. Those were significant moments, and more so if you consider the fact that this was the first time that the African Union at least participated in this as a regional member and will continue to do so going forward. Sophie, I want to start with you. The African Union has always been described as toothless when you compare it to its global counterparts in terms of its multilateral efforts. If you compare it to the EU, for instance, although they do slightly different things, but the EU has been able to, and it of course has a longer and stronger legacy than the African Union, but many said the African Union doesn't seem to stand up for a collective African voice. But yeah, it seems like they had a moment, and it seems to me at least that they won. Do you get a sentiment that they did?
Well, I think they have achieved a lot, and I think thanks to South Africa, because South Africa has been very consistent in terms of the development of the continent. You would recall that the first leader to chair the African Union was South Africa, the former South African President Thabo Mbeki, and with his counterparts from Algeria, Bouteflika, Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, and Zenawi from Ethiopia. They came up, including Senegal, Abdoulaye Wade, they came up with the NEPAD, and that was a blueprint for the development of the continent. They took that blueprint to the G7, G8 at the time, to try and say to the developed countries in the north, here is our blueprint in terms of development. There was an agreement, but institutional memory and change of leadership sometimes leads to weakening of institutions. When that leadership left leadership of the African continent, there was new leadership failure in terms of continuing with what they had done, because there's this notion that when I come in, I'm going to change everything.
Yeah.
I start from scratch instead of building on what is there already. So I think this time around, we see a similar thing happening, where Africa
have we, just
saying,
on that, Sophie, have we ever seen a case where the most powerful countries in the world come together and say, we collectively commit to these priorities on the African continent in the way that they have this weekend?
That's exactly what happened when the AU met the G7 countries. They did that with NEPAD. They adopted NEPAD. But there was no follow-up to ensure that there's implementation. Now, a similar thing has happened here, where these developed countries, in particular within the G20, have agreed to do just that. But the challenge will be implementation. And that's what I asked the minister when I spoke to the Minister of Finance, Godongwana, that I get you that you are able to make progress on finance track, and there's an adoption of the declaration already. Yeah. But secondly, even the United States of America is saying we want to partner on issues that are related to infrastructure. Now, it will be up to Minister Godongwana, that report of Trevor Manuel, to pull together his peers on the continent, his counterparts, to ensure that there's implementation. So it's about leadership. Yeah. That's exactly what Guterres said. We don't have leadership.
Ronesh, we have the EU-Africa Summit. We have the China-Africa Summit, the Japan-Africa Summit. Everybody has a summit with Africa where exactly these priorities are being discussed, and almost bilaterally being agreed to between the host nation states and the African continent as a country bloc. And we saw Trump do a similar effort earlier this year with a number of African leaders that had visited the White House. Is this just another one of?
You know what, I hate to be very pessimistic, but I have my doubts. It's like there's been too much talking. Now's the time for action. We're in the year 2025. You know, something has to change. Something's got to give. Africa's been left behind. The developing world has been left behind. That is why this G20 summit that we have in South Africa, the very first time on the African soil, that is why it's so important, it's so significant. Something has to change in the way the world is structured. We no longer in the world of 1944, 1945. You know, Africa's voice has to be heard. It has to be amplified. We've got 55 different separate nations, very different from each other, very unique, very diversified. Their voices need to be brought to the fore. If you look at multilateral organizations like the UN, we look at the General Assembly, we've got 193 member nations, and then we've got the Security Council. You look at the representation of that Security Council, the issue of the veto vote. You know, we've got 5 nations that, you know, post-World War II, they're still sitting in that same structure, and they are basically dictating how global politics, global economics are supposed to be run in 2025. How is that possible? Tell me, 80 years on, how is that possible? So for me, it is another talk show, but like Ma'am Sophie said earlier on as well, I think maybe something will come of this. We read the declaration earlier on, you know, very unusual. Normally it's, you know, on the last day of any big event of this nature, you know, the declaration is issued, but it was released very early this morning, just after 10 o'clock. I think it was a little preemptive. I think it was very good PR, especially for South Africa, considering the US's stance in terms of not coming here, in terms of the ugly sentiment being spewed on social media, and all sorts of nasty things that's been going on, especially on social media. So I think, you know, maybe something will come off this G20 summit, but I think my concern, if you look at the past 4 G20 summits, all global South countries, we had Bali, Indonesia, then we had New Delhi, India, then we had Brazil last year, and then this South Africa. The Troika, the past is going to be South Africa, the present is going to be the US, and then the UK is going to be the future. And then after the UK is going to be South Korea. My concern is going to be global South countries, global North countries, whatever was agreed here in that declaration, 30 pages or so. You know what, it's going to be highly, you know what, it's going to be very pruned. It's going to be pruned to the, you know, to the bone. All those developmental agenda items, I think Trump is not going to stand for it. Trump or, you know, the UK a year ahead, and then South Korea, all 3 are very close allies. So I think it's very good what was achieved here. We'll see what happens tomorrow as well. The declaration looks very promising.
It seems to me that Prime Minister Keir Starmer sees South Africa as an important trade partner. I mean, he landed at OR Tambo, and the first stop he made was to a Gautrain depot, because some of the Gautrain coaches are being manufactured in England, and that's a really important deal. And of course, Premier Panyaza Lesufi is quite excited about his bullet train and speed rail expansion into Limpopo, and one would imagine that Keir Starmer imagines himself to be a key partner in that. So he certainly has a different sentiment to Trump. How powerful is he on the top end of that troika in keeping some of those priorities intact?
I think Keir Starmer's, he's a very selfish politician. I think his primary alliances are going to stick. It's not going to be Africa first. I think those alliances with the US, we've seen what what they've done in the Middle East, and in all sorts of different places. If we talk about Ukraine, you know, there was a possible peace agreement in Ukraine as early as 2022. Turkey. I think it was called the Istanbul process. The President Erdogan actually forged that proposal to actually bring the Ukraine-Russia war to a close, but the UK and the US derailed it totally. So that's why I'm very hesitant. I'm very doubtful. Those alliances will stick. So I'm concerned the global South, the past 4 years, the next 3 years, it's going to be the US, the UK, South Korea, Africa, the developing world, the global South issues. I think it's not going to, we're going to regress. We're going to take 10 steps back. I'm hoping it won't go that direction, but I think it is going to head in that direction. And I think maybe Tshepo and Ma'am Sophie will probably support me on this.
I think I want to weigh in on this.
Sure, please do.
You are correct. The Troika will have to ensure that the 2 countries, South Africa and the United Kingdom, that much as the incoming or the next country that will be leading this forum is the United States of America, the country that is very unpredictable. The behind the scenes, the United Kingdom played a very key role to ensure that we arrive at this moment, together with France. The president lobbied these two countries, and they were the ones convincing other member states within the European Union group in Europe. And yes, if there's a change of leadership in the United Kingdom in 2027, we may regress. But with the United Kingdom coming in, and there's hope that the UK will continue with this approach. And the good thing with the forum is that you don't have the secretariat, you have this troika. So it will be 2+1. So, and it's just a matter of 12 months next year. And he might be a lame duck, Donald Trump, because the midterm elections are coming.
Yeah, look, I mean, the Labour Party of Corbyn seems to be making its way back stronger than the Labour Party of Starmer, right?
And there's no way the Labour Party will agree with Trump.
Absolutely. Tshepo, the African Continental Free Trade Act, we've had at least 5 years of it now. It's been operationalized piecemeal so, and one would understand why that is the case. And this declaration speaks about, in the partnership with Africa, the establishment of the African Engagement Framework to support the African Continental Free Trade Area. We haven't gotten it right as a continent. What sort of support would we be ultimately looking for? Because the devil's in the detail here.
Yeah, no, there's been a lot of slow progress. And the point that I made earlier is African leaders have held the process back on a number of fronts. I think sovereignty remains a stumbling block. There are non-tariff issues that remain unresolved so far. So the playing field it's still full of a number of challenges. The other point that I made earlier is, for example, something as basic as the cross-border payment. Cross-border payment, it takes about 25% of your capital. That's a huge amount. So there are measures in place to ensure that that is addressed. The central bank is working on.
I want to pause you on that. It's fascinating to me that we still have high transaction fees on cross-border payments when Africa's been leading the world in fintech. I mean, one would assume that we would have subverted the Visas and the MasterCards of the world as a central transaction system. Is the African Continental Free Trade Area Act actually applying its mind to those sort of things?
Well, some of these challenges are not the terrain of the organization itself. It's a central bank, it's regional blocks. It's I mean, we have 3 regional blocks, East and West. They all have their payment system. But they are not integrated. They are still separate. SADC, we do our own thing. East Africa, West Africa is doing its own thing. There's no interoperability. The central banks during the recent G20 meeting said that there must be some interoperability. And once we've got this right, hopefully they'll be able to bring in, reduce the cost. The other issue, you need to bring innovation, fintech, to play in that particular space. But we have seen people coming in, but it's regional. We're still not seeing much in terms of integration because the systems are still not allowing them.
And sort of ECOWAS doing their own thing, SADC doing their own thing.
Absolutely. Okay. So we are not integrated. Our central banks are not talking to one another so that you can have a seamless process that can actually
So how
work.
important then is it for us to get those basics right before we even speak to the rest of the world about supporting us on this?
It is important. It's something that the Reserve Bank across the continent in those regions are currently in negotiation, so that they can actually come up with the interconnectedness of those payment systems and bring down the cost. Because if that is not done, how long it takes, I think there are a lot of technicalities. The problem is, unlike in the European Union, we believe in our independence. And sometimes in order to get this integration working, you have to lose some of your independence and allow integration to happen. So that is a major challenge on the continent.
Ronesh, part of what's holding back the continent is its indebtedness. 50 states across the world spent more on debt service costs than they do on basic services, or at least basic service. It would be a second or third line item when you look at their fiscal frameworks. South Africa is certainly one such country. And when you look at those 50 countries, most of them are on the continent. Malawi is a more recent case of debt default, right? Sovereign debt default, which has hurt its economy quite tremendously. It had to go back to its creditors and renegotiate those debt terms, and they went through a debt restructuring process. They're now sort of back on their knees, still making their way up. But this was a discussion point here. Is it lip service, or do you think there's a real attempt at talking to the Bretton Woods institutions, talking to the major players in the G20 and saying, hey guys, let's relook how we do debt with the rest of, particularly the global South?
You know what, Oliver, I want to be positive. I really want to be positive. I hope it's not just lip service, but I think, you know, politicians, when it comes to these big kind of events, when a declaration is issued, nothing much happens thereafter. But if you look at all the numbers, the developing world, they owe, in terms of external debt, 31 trillion. Africa, part of that, owes externally 1.8 trillion. To service that debt alone is 90 billion per year. That's 90 billion a year that could have gone to social issues like education, health, and you know, all sorts of social things, infrastructure projects within the country. 90 billion alone is owed to China in terms of bilateral trades, you know, bilateral debt. Even Pope Leo recently, when President Cyril Ramaphosa made a visit to the Vatican, he gave support to the issue of how these rating agencies actually operate.
In fact, yesterday we broke the story on the letter that was written by 82 religious leaders across the world, 35 countries, many of them cardinals and bishops, throwing their weight behind the voice of the Pope there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Pope Leo spoke about the issue of inequality and debt. And then when Pope Francis was around as well, he brought up the issue of the IMF and rating agencies. And we saw in the declaration, we saw in the finance track discussions, the issue of the rating agencies came up as well. They want, no bias. They want fairness, they want transparency, and then a very, very significant and a very important matter that no one's actually focusing on is the issue of bond yields. An American or, the Western world can borrow from the capital markets at very reduced rates compared to the developing world and compared to an African country. I'll give you an example of Serbia and Ivory Coast. Both countries have similar metrics, but it costs Ivory Coast, I think, 10 or 20% more than it costs for Serbia, despite them having, same kind of metrics, like I said earlier on. I think the risk perception when it comes to Africa, there's a possibility of African countries defaulting on the debt, like you touched on earlier on. I think those issues need to be looked at very, very closely.
So I spoke to the country head of S&P, which is a ratings agency in South Africa, very specifically about the notch they gave us up to 2 below investment grade, I think we're standing at now. And I asked, what were some of the indices that you looked at? And I asked specifically that question. The answer I got was, you may compare a country in the global south to a country in the global north and say similar scales of economy, similar GDP, similar population sizes, as we typically do when we measure out OECD nation states, right? But the answer there was the strength of the institutions matter a great deal. And the argument often is that Africa's institutions don't always stand when they're under attack. And that seems to be the case to be true, at least in some countries. Zimbabwe comes to mind as a country whose institutions was under attack. Are we perhaps not underplaying the role that plays?
I think there is some truth in that, but I think you've got to look, that issue, you've got to look at the history of Africa. You've got to look at the colonial history of African countries. Those developed economies of the global north, they've had independence much, much longer than these African countries. I take you back to 1945 again. I take you back to the 50s, to the 60s, to the 70s, to the 80s, to the 90s. Most African countries were still under colonialism. It takes a very long time to establish democracy, to entrench democracy, and get institutions that actually strengthen democracy in those countries. So I think we are a long way from that. We are slowly making progress, but unless you address those root causes causes of why those institutions are so weak, then I think it will take much longer.
I want to portion that, Tshepo. I know you wanted to say something, but I don't want to lose the thought I have here. And that is, some of the vulnerabilities we have seem to be perceptive, and I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
But, Sophie, corruption is not perceptive. It's a real thing. And part of the African story is, no matter how strong your institutions are, South Africa has great institutions, but corruption seems to be endemic on the continent, and that's part of that risk profile. Are we, honestly, as African nation states, talking to each other about overcoming our corruption pandemic?
I don't think so. Yes, at the ordinary people level, you get Africans talking, and that is why you see this civil
So when
unrest.
presidents meet, they don't talk about it?
They talk about it, but they just make statements.
Okay.
Look at the illicit financial flows. Why are they not having legislations in their countries to deal with this problem? Because you can save a lot of money, and that money can go to development. Why are they not having legislation? It's because we talk about corruption, but at times we don't act. Secondly, they don't strengthen institutions that support democracy, as you pointed out. If you don't do that, your country is going to be vulnerable. South Africa is facing lots of challenges. The poverty level is quite a challenge, but most of the institutions are holding. Your financial system is one of the best in the world, and you are able to protect the country against vulnerability. So it is important that we really discuss this issue. It's not just a lip service.
But we have decent bond yield on this continent. South Africa is a good example, one of the most stable in the world, but we still consider it a risky market.
Well, it's a bit of both. I think when it comes to ratings, okay, let's start with the bond yields. I think our bond yields, a 10-year bond yield currently sitting at around 8.6, 8.7 there. It's quite relative.
Consistently above inflation, by the way.
It is above inflation. It helps us because it attracts a lot of capital inflows into our bond market. It has actually come down a little bit, which is a reflection of our risk premium. Well, it's not comparable to the rest of the continent, which run a double digit, which is much higher. I mean, compared to the US, their bond yields are sitting at around 4%. And because at times that's lower, interest rate differentials, we benefit from there. They come in and put money in the continent. But on the
this is, by the way, why our foreign gold reserves are so well endowed, pegged against the US dollar, exactly for the reason that we have that protection and buffer there.
No, of course, we have been building those reserves a lot of time, and of course the performance of the gold price has done us a big favor in building up those buffers. Although the policy of protecting ourselves, we believe that the market should be the main driver that determines the direction of the rent. We don't lean against the wind, as they say, so we don't control.
Given all of that, why do capital markets who care purely on the numbers still consider us a little riskier? Because that speaks to how expensive our debt is ultimately.
It is the unjust wealth. It is
well, it is
the unjust wealth.
Let's be honest.
I think at South Africa we are risk, but we are not relatively risk as compared to the rest of the continent. We are not defaulting on and there's no risk of a default. We've got sound financial systems, so there is no.
Greece defaulted. The EU was standing by to bail them out. Right?
No, absolutely. I want to go back to the point of the rating agency as why they often give them a high rating and a poor rating. One of the major concerns is the fact that if you go to a country, you want to trust the numbers. You want to know that the statistical bodies, the numbers that they are producing, the GDP numbers, the inflation numbers, their fiscal framework, all those numbers you can trust. But often you find that there is lack of credibility on the numbers that those bodies produce. I attended a body earlier in my career, a conference earlier in my career organized by Stats SA, inviting the statistical bodies from the continent. And you could tell that it was so obvious that the credibility remained the major issue, and government interference in the numbers that they produce. We don't have that kind of a problem. We can trust what our statistical body produces. So when these review are made and they cannot trust the numbers, so obviously the risk premium will be much, much higher because they don't understand exactly what they are dealing with.
Sophie, I want to bring it to this part of the conversation. The critical minerals part of this declaration was really important for me. They had agreed to adopt a G20 critical minerals framework. Now, the question of critical minerals is not a scientific question. It is a political question. And it's a political question, ultimately, because countries assess their mineral resources against their needs, against the market, and they make a decision about what is a critical mineral to us. An example is South Africa has as much palladium reserves as Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe considers palladium a critical reserve, a critical mineral. We don't necessarily rate it that high because we've got all these other stuff. Minister Gwede Mantashe hosts his continental counterparts every year, yet there still isn't an African G20 or an African framework for what a critical mineral is. And here the G20 is about to decide what it is. Do you think, because it's a political question, that the big power players, particularly the G7 nations in the G20, might want to dominate the conversation about what a critical mineral should be so that they can control the flow of those minerals? Or do you think that we've established quite enough a strong consensus on the continent to not allow that to happen?
Well, I think on the continent there is consensus, in terms of the critical minerals, because countries have realized that they are having serious challenges. And some of them, we saw the coup in the Sahel region because of that. And therefore, they are aware that you can be next because we are integrated on the continent in terms of influence and flow of information. But the issue here is leadership. You have to put your foot down. The first industrial revolution was about empowering the developed North. Look, we're talking developed North because of the first industrial revolution. Where did they get the minerals from? On the continent. Now, this time around, you have a young population. It's up to them to stand up, to ensure that, again, we are not shortchanged. It can never be that the fourth industrial revolution, again, we give them minerals and they come back very expensive. They have to understand that this is the only way you can ensure development, but also to be able to have power on the continent, to power the economy. Because those batteries, the renewables, these big developed countries are using our minerals to develop such or manufacture such. So the issue of us as Africans, value chain should be a critical issue to us. Whatever we have, we must benefit and build those factories in South Africa, manufacturing. We must have a strong industrial policy on the continent.
Ronesh, I'm very excited about what's happening in the middle south of the continent. DRC is speaking to Malawi, Zambia, and Angola, which is important because that's where the Lobito corridor is being developed, and that's an important part of the African development story, particularly when it comes to our mineral resources. But that's an isolated case on the continent, right? And it's still a conversation in its nascent stages. How skeptical should we be collectively as the Global South when we begin to build what that G20 critical minerals framework looks like?
Oliver, unfortunately, I'm just going to give you a hat trick. I'm not being pessimistic at all, but this is the reality. Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic at all, because like Ma'am Sophie said, if you look at the countries of DRC, you look at Sudan, you look at Mozambique, there were attacks in Mozambique, it was mineral related. Sudan, we know it's about gold reserves. The DRC, we know it's about cobalt. It's a rare earth minerals. If you look at the numbers, China produces 70% of all rare earth minerals. China refines 90% of all rare earth minerals.
In fact, China imports most of the chrome that's being mined in South Africa.
From South Africa, yeah. Those rare earth minerals, what are they used for? They're used for LED lights, cell phones, headphones, weapons such as missiles and fighter jets. Who needs those kind of minerals in the West? It's America, it's all the Western nations, France, Germany, all those countries. The global north, the developed world needs all of those. So I think it is about resource extraction, but we have to get to the root of the problem. It is about political will, it is about lack of political leadership. It's very nice, good and well to be populist and, claim that we've been liberated and, sail on that liberation narrative 5, 10, 15 years post-liberation. But I think that political will, political leadership is needed. Africa, again, I go back to Africa. Why are we so divided? A central point of empire was divide and rule. We saw in South Africa during our apartheid past. Why did apartheid last so long? Because everyone was divided. We had the different homelands, and that's why people could not unify. But just to digress.
Yeah.
But this philosophy of the Western world using this divide and conquer rule, I think it's still very evident in Africa. Like Tshepo touched on earlier on, African leaders are speaking with different tongues. What's going to happen once this summit ends tomorrow? These African leaders showed strength of unity at the forum today in the plenary. But once they leave this venue, are they going to speak with one voice? I think that is where my concern and my worry is going to be focused on.
Yeah, Tshepo, very quickly, 30 seconds. Are you excited about this G20 critical mineral framework?
Well, I am excited about it, but I think we need to get the basics right. Of course, to mine, it costs a lot of money. You need investors. But I think we also need to link prospecting and mining license to beneficiation at base. Once we get that strategy right. But unfortunately, sometimes you find that leaders want quick cash. It's easier to make money if you export. You don't have to spend a lot of time, but beneficiation takes time. So you extract and you've got your money, you can deal with your issues quickly.
If it's put to port, really, that's what it is. Well, but that's where we're going to have to leave this conversation here this evening. And I think that brings us to an end of our time here at the Nasrec Expo Center, where the G20 Summit is taking place. Tomorrow morning, we're bright and early back here for session 3, which will focus, by the way, in plenary on that question that I asked last of critical minerals. That's what the heads of states will be deliberating on tomorrow.